Today's guest is the Chief of Orthopaedics and Director of Orthopaedic Sports Medicine at Lord's Medical Centre, an Assistant Professor of Orthopaedic Surgery at Rowan University, and over the past decade has impacted more than 15,000 lives. And today he's going to share with you new insights, ideas and information to improve your quality of life after injury. Would you please help us welcome to the live stream Dr. Sean McMillan.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that.
Sean, great to see you there. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. This is going to be an exciting time, man. I really appreciate this.
Mate, I'm really excited. And just to project forward into the future, you always want to know a specialist in the field of orthopedics when it's your turn to have an injury. I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. Now, Sean, in America, more than 400,000 people damage their ACL every year. Firstly, could you help us explain what an ACL is and what an ACL tear is?
Sure. So the ACL, it stands for the anterior cruciate ligament, is a ligament that connects your thigh bone to your shin bone. And you kind of take it for granted when you do straight ahead walking. But the ACL is important for preventing your knee from sort of going out of whack when you go to pivot, or when you go to run and try and stop quickly. So the ACL is really, really important for people that are athletic, people that are younger. And when you tear that ligament, not only do you lose stability in your joint, but you also lose what's called proprioception, which is the ability to know where you are in space. So what happens in that case is you might be able to walk straight ahead, but if you had to, run for any reason, pivot quickly, the knee will buckle, and that can lead to pain, swelling, and then other injuries like meniscal tears.
Now, when I was 18, I was an athlete, and I was in the sport of wakeboarding. And one of the big risks of wakeboarding was having an ACL tear. And I had seen my brother go through that ACL tear, and there was always this rumour around the scene that if you tore your ACL, you could hear it from the boat. So you could imagine there's a boat going down the lake at 26 miles an hour. So you're cutting through the water, the wind's next to your ears, and then the rider could be on a rope that is between 60 and 80 feet behind the boat. And there was always this rumour that you could hear the ACL pop, and we never believed it until my brother popped his. And everybody in the boat said that they could hear the snap and this pop in the boat. And I remember just how painful it was for him. The ACL tore, and then immediately his knee had swollen up. And then after his first operation, he got a blood clot, and then he had a series of other operations. So it was a very significant emotional event for him because he was at the top of his field. He was an Australian champion, and he never knew if he was going to be able to go on to be a world champion. And, you always hear of somebody doing their ACL, but it was happening to almost everybody around me. I'd say at least 25% of people had torn their ACLs in our sport at the professional level, but at least half of people are having knee problems. So as this happens, as they tear their ACL, how does this impact them emotionally? What do you see your patients go through emotionally after they tear their ACL?
The emotional toll is probably the most underrated of all, because you have usually a high-level athlete or a competitive high school athlete who comes in, they're on top of their game, they went to that game that day, feeling great, having a good game maybe, and then in a blink of an eye, it just stops. And now they're hearing from a physician that they require surgery, not that we can treat this without surgery, and that the return to sport is going to be somewhere from 9 months to a year, and that's assuming everything goes well. So immediately you start, turning to the internet, you start turning to your friends, you're looking at Dr. Google and trying to figure out what's going to happen to you. But there's this flood of emotion that kind of comes out once the words come out of my mouth to the patient that you tore your ACL. It's almost you're in denial until you hear it. And as a physician, my role is to sort of comfort them, let them know, hey, listen, the worst is over now, and now we got to start our road to recovery. And if I can liken their favorite athlete or their favorite sport to someone who overcame that, or a colleague of theirs, if they know someone who overcame it, I try to do that so they have some perspective to realize that they can get back to where they want to be. It's just going to take a lot of effort.
I love that you said denial, because when I was having problems with my knee, I was definitely in denial. I would go out and do wakeboarding, and it's a very intense sport. So you're jumping the wake of the boat, you're going up in the air 10, 12 feet, you're going 30 feet outside the wake, and it's like landing on concrete every time you do these big tricks. And by the end of the ride, my leg was almost frozen at a 90-degree angle. And I'd drag myself out of the water, I'd drag myself up the boat ramp. And I thought to myself, over time, this would heal itself. So I'd constantly put off going to the doctor because I was afraid of that bad news. I was fearing that our doctor, his name's Dr. Michael Walsh, I thought Dr. Michael Walsh was going to say to me, Daniel, you've done your ACL, you've done your meniscus, and you're not going to be able to ride again. And so I think I was very ignorant, thinking that time would heal this wound. But over time, it got worse, and I didn't even realize I was doing more damage to myself physically. But I think the damage that I was doing to myself emotionally was equally as great. Because instead of going out and focusing on landing my tricks, I was focusing on not falling. And we believe that you get what you focus on. So I would fall more. And then I ended up fearing injury, which eventually led to even more injury. So I then tore my posterior cruciate ligament. And then I heard those frightening words from our orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Michael Walsh. Daniel, you've torn your posterior cruciate. You won't be riding for 12 months. And that was devastating. That was really devastating. And so I felt that pain. And then I thought to myself, through my own ignorance, I could have possibly even prevented this. But I didn't know how to approach the doctor. So when people have these fears, do they avoid coming to see a specialist? As you mentioned before, they go to Dr. Google. What are some of these things that they do before they come and speak to the professionals?
Yeah, so a lot of patients will actually sort of take it into their own hands. And one of the interesting things, Daniel, is that the ACL, once you tear it, it doesn't hurt. So 3 or 4 days go by, the swelling starts to get out of that leg, the knee doesn't hurt anymore. So they feel like, all right, I'm going to be okay, I can walk this off. And then, as you mentioned, they'll go back to doing some of their normal activities. But because you don't have that stabilizer, the knee will buckle and give out, and now you run the risk of further damage, as you alluded to. So patients will oftentimes sort of test themselves. I think I know my own body. Let me see what I can do. And that's not always a great idea. Other times patients will seek alternative treatments, whether it's something online, whether it's a supplement, whether it's an injection of something not standard of care in medicine, but something we're willing to try as an alternative to the reality sometimes. And those are dangerous, particularly if they're not regulated. And that's something we encourage our patients, speak to your doctor before you seek out something alternative. No one dies, this, from an ACL tear. So the worst that happens is you don't ride again, but I don't have to do your surgery, but at least get the information, understand what your risks and benefits are, and figure out the right road for you.
I love that. Nobody dies from it. I'll tell you what happened to me. My dreams died. I didn't die physically, but it was a very slow death emotionally. So I was 18, and then I realized that my sporting career was going to come to an end. And I was given good advice from my doctor, and he said, Daniel, you need to heal this, you need to go into rehabilitation, and you shouldn't ride again. But I didn't know my own limits. I didn't know my limits. So I was like, okay, well, I'm Daniel Danger. Danger's my middle name. And I'm going to go out there. I'm going to prove the doctor wrong. What the hell would he know? He doesn't know who I am. I'm 18. I'm full of testosterone. I can do this. So I went out there and I did rehabilitation, and I went out and rode. And then almost 12 months to the day, I was booking my second consultation with him because I'd torn the cartilage this time. And he said to me, Daniel, you don't seem to follow good advice. I said, I know. I said, I'm Daniel Danger. I said, I'm not going to listen to the advice. And he said, well, I advise you that this time you really listen to my advice. And I went out there and I had my next operation. So I lost a couple of good years of playing sport. And rather than playing sport, I started to focus on my career. But that slow death inside me, Dr. Sean, was I was now working, paying off my operations, and I was seeing everybody else do what I love to do. Everybody else was competing at X Games. They were competing at the state titles. They were winning the Australian Championships. And it was a very slow death for me. And eventually I became the Australian champion athlete. But I could have got there so much faster if I just learned more about my body. And I think you hit the nail on the head, and we talk about this in emotional intelligence, is knowing our limitations. Knowing our limitations. And getting past that stubborn nature that we can have where we refuse to ask for help. We refuse to ask for help because we think that asking for help is a weakness, when asking for help is a sign of strength. And I now think, as I reflect, and a lot of people get onto these, these YouTube channels and they say, I've got no regrets in my life. No, I've got a big regret. I should have asked for advice early before it even happened. And so I think you're right. It might not cause the physical death, but the death of your dreams, I believe, from my perspective, is equally as painful.
You touch on something pretty important there. We do surgery. I'm a surgeon, and we know it takes a certain amount of time to do the surgery, and we tell a patient the recovery. We do a lot of physical therapy, but we don't rehab the mind. And there's a big push in sports, particularly with pro athletes and college athletes, for psychological counseling going through the rehab. You'll have athletes that'll tell you, my knee feels structurally strong at 9 months, but I didn't feel like myself again for 18 months, 17 months. I didn't trust it. And then there's this fear, as you mentioned, of re-tearing it, or the counter of that is there is no fear. I got to prove someone wrong. And I think if we did a little bit of counseling, just like rehab on the knee, we could probably prevent some secondary and third injuries down the road, as well as get people back into sport that are afraid to go back to sport. So that's something we overlook, but it's super important, Dan.
My operations were in 1998, 1999. I won the Australian Championships in 2006, and I did not feel fully confident to ride and to go to an extreme level until it would have been about 2013, 2014. And it wasn't that my body wasn't ready. My mind wasn't ready and my emotions weren't ready. And I had done a lot of work on myself, personal development, to overcome my fears around that, the years 2010, 11 and 12. And then I had the courage to get back on the water. And what I'd learned is once I got back on the water after dealing with those fears, especially that fear of being re-injured, the fear of losing my financial stability, once I overcome those fears, I went out and I started to ride. And I hadn't competed for almost 7 years. But after 7 years, what I found, because I'd updated and upgraded my mind, overcame my fears, my tricks when I went out on the water were bigger than they were back in 2006. I could ride for longer. My tricks became more advanced. And then I realized that my body had repaired many, many years ago. There was nothing wrong with the body. It then was all in the mind. But nobody was there to guide me through that. And so that was a big awakening for me. The body was fine, but the mind was still stuck probably back in 98, 99. And they were some of the risks for me. What do you see? What are some of the risks for leaving these ACLs untreated, or even minor damage untreated? What are the risks involved?
So when you think about why the ACL is there, it's for stability. So if you don't fix that ACL and choose to go down the road of treating it with a brace or strengthening, it's great, but you still have micro instability there. And we both know that if things are rubbing the way they shouldn't, over time it causes wearing. God gives you a precious amount of cartilage in your knee to keep the bones from rubbing. And when that bone sort of rubs away that cartilage, you develop arthritis. And that's the biggest problem that we see down the road is tears of the menisci and then arthritis. And we know this, Dan, and I hate to break the news to you, but when you tear your ACL, there's an inherent risk that you're going to get arthritis one day, even with a reconstruction. So that risk is amplified, though, if you don't reconstruct it. So either way, you're going to head down a road of arthritis one day, but it's how you're going to get there. Is it going to be slow and steady, or is it going to be all at once? So that's why we urge people to get these fixed. And some of the newer science that we're working on is aimed to sort of decrease that risk of arthritis with these ACL surgeries.
I remember when I wanted to go to see the specialist, there was only one in my area. And the rumour was he always liked to do surgery. And they always said, be careful, you're gonna go in and he's gonna want to do surgery immediately. And I think that scared the pants off a lot of people. How do you get around that today with new technology? Because it's been more than 20 years since I had my operations, and it's 20 years since, probably longer, 22 years since my brother had his 5 operations. How do you get around that initial, it's time for surgery? What's available today?
Yeah, so I mean, truthfully, the ACL is one of the few tears that we have orthopedically that almost always requires surgery. Taking out of the equation a elderly patient that may have had a trauma. By and large, if you're athletic, we're having that conversation. It needs to be fixed. But what we do is we sort of set the stage for, I want to know about you before we even get to the end of this story. I ask, what are your sports? What are your hobbies? How well do you play? Or were you a starter? What's your goal for next year, the next 5 years? Because it tells me a little bit more about their place where they are now, but also their psyche for the future. And then we tailor that recovery to them. So not every surgery is the same. If you came into my clinic, you might get one type of ACL surgery, whereas the gal down the street might get a different one, because I want to make sure that I'm meeting your goals. And then I set the timelines based upon that. A wakeboarder, I'm going to be a lot more cautious with going back at 9 months, whereas someone who wants to be able to just run track, there's a lot less inherent risks involved with running in a straight line. So we always look at tailoring that, and I think patients appreciate that because I let them know that their surgery is individualized, but nevertheless, we have to do it, and then we give them options. I let them feel like they're part of the conversation in picking their graft choice, or if we want to try something a little more experimental with biologics. I let them understand the science behind things. We put a lot of good information on our website, and we direct them there to do some at-home reading, and then we reconvene to go over everything again to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Now, what I know is that you're over there on the east coast of America, in Philadelphia, but you've got people flying over from the west coast. And for my friends in Australia, that's almost the same distance from Perth to Sydney. It's a long way. These people are travelling from the west coast to the east coast to have a consultation with you. What is that thing that you're really doing different that they can't get maybe on the west coast that you're delivering here on the east coast?
Yeah, so you mentioned things evolve, right? So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, we're trying to find ways to sort of repair the ACL. And like I mentioned, the ACL is something that needs surgery, but it's one of the few ligaments that up until recently you had to replace. You couldn't actually just sew it back together. And with some advances in science that we've been able to sort of achieve, we're able to, in many instances, save the native ACL that's there and help it regenerate. There's this phenomenal scientist and surgeon, Dr. Martha Murray, out of Boston Children's Hospital here, who devoted her life to finding a cure for this ACL epidemic and being able to heal it. And I've been able to be part of this sort of study moving forward. And it's really captivated patients that are seeking ways to keep their own parts and restore them rather than replace them. And just like we talked about, Dan, when I meet a patient, I find out everything I can about them. And then if they're interested in that sort of surgery, I make sure that it's right for them because I don't want to give them a surgery that's going to fail. So if I think they're not a great candidate, I'll explain why. I'll give them the best choices. But again, a lot of these consultations are happening now. We had a gentleman fly over from New Delhi, India, the other day to see us for this. And again, same thing. We did a consultation over the Zoom first. We spoke. We looked at the MRIs, and he said, "This is me," and he flew over. And there's a lot of physicians now in the world that are starting to pick up on this. So it's coming your way, Dan. Hang tight.
I love it. I love it. Now, for those friends of ours who are wanting to learn more, where's the best place they can go now to learn more about you and what you're doing here with ACLs?
Yeah, so our website is pretty comprehensive with information on this and other technologies that we do. My website is www.drseanmcmillan.com, and that'll take you almost everywhere you need to be to find out the information on this.
Ladies and gentlemen, jump on that website now. I'm going to put it in the show notes below so it makes it nice and easy for you. Click on the website, go and learn more about it today. And as we say, prevention is better than cure. Dr. Sean, I really appreciate your time today and thank you for spending time with our Accelerate and Multiply community. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, jump on the website now, drseanmcmillan.com. The link is in the show notes below. Thank you for joining us, and remember, One idea at the right time is enough to change your life. Have a wonderful day. Dr. Sean, thank you. Beautiful. Thank you.